A substantial enemy force was neutralized by a small handful of Americans who operated behind Japanese lines in Burma from 1942 to mid-1945. The prospect of an invasion of India by Japan was finally averted when the Japanese relinquished control of Burma. A small group of Americans serving in the Office of Strategic Services, OSS Detachment 101, trained and commanded a formidable guerrilla force that persistently plagued the Japanese army in Burma. This was in response to the Japanese desire to establish a strong military presence in Southeast Asia from Myanmar. In the aftermath of the December 7, 1941, attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese proceeded to conquer the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Borneo, Malaya, and Burma. Additionally, they successfully conquered most of the smaller islands in the Central and South Pacific during their invasion. The Japanese were ready to pose a danger to India and Australia after 5 months of war. In the spring of 1942, the Japanese easily captured Burma. Invaders made short work of the capitals of Rangoon and Mandalay. Those Indian and British soldiers who were able to flee made it to India. American General Joseph Stilwell also led a Chinese army into retreat. The fast-advancing Japanese soldiers almost captured Stilwell himself. Assisting the invaders were a large number of Burmese from the lowlands. They were of assistance to the Japanese since they reinforced the 5th Column's operations during night raids, ambushes, and demolitions. Following the British withdrawal, many Burmese held out optimism that their nation would finally gain its freedom after 8 centuries of colonization. After hearing the Japanese propaganda about Asia for the Asians, the Burmese were even more oppressed politically, economically, and socially by the new occupiers. The advancement of the conflict in Southeast Asia was greatly influenced by Burma. One of the most important routes for supplies to reach Chinese armies from Allied outposts in India was the Burma Road, which passed across the northern highlands of the nation. Once the Japanese took control of Burma, the only way for the Allies to feed the Chinese was to fly over the treacherous Himalayas. The risky air route was dubbed the Hump. It was an incredibly inefficient and expensive means of transporting vital commodities. If the Japanese had intended to invade India, Burma would have been an essential staging ground. In order to lessen these dangers to the effective pursuit of victory in the war in Southeast Asia, the United States and Britain's retaking of Burma became vital. At the same time, the United States government was formulating strategies to counter the Japanese. If these strategists wanted to free the countries that the Japanese had taken control over, they would have to resort to espionage and subversion. American President Franklin D. Roosevelt aspired to model his Special Operations Executive, SOE, after the British program, which had been in place for some time and was well established. It was General William J., whom Roosevelt chose. Columbia Law School classmate of the President, Wild Bill Donovan, to establish a scheme akin to the one run by the British. The CIA's modern-day antecedent, the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, was formerly known as the Office of the Coordinator of Information, but would soon change its name to reflect its purpose. Back when Wild Bill Donovan was the head of the United States Marine Corps, he was a Wall Street lawyer and a former Assistant U.S. Attorney General. Serving in World War I with the illustrious fighting 69th Regiment of the Rainbow Division of the United States Army. Along with General Douglas MacArthur, he was one of only 2 soldiers to possess all 3 of the nation's highest honors: the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, and the Distinguished Service Medal. It was clear that the Allies could have achieved significant success in Burma through a policy of sabotage and subversion. In the north of the country, a thick jungle provided excellent cover for guerrilla fighters. Donovan contacted General Stilwell shortly after taking office in order to devise such a plan. The army did not have any pre-existing agenda to form troops capable of such job. Therefore, the effort had to be launched from the beginning. The planned excursions into Burma were fortunate in that Stilwell had a candidate to command this unit. While in Hawaii, Captain Carl Eifler oversaw a company that belonged to the 35th Infantry Regiment. Eifler had a formidable presence. Eifler, in Stilwell's opinion, had all the qualities necessary to head such a rigorous program. He was over 6 feet 2 inches tall, over 250 pounds, and competent in jiu-jitsu. In his own part, Eifler wasted no time in assembling a team of officers and non-commissioned officers he believed could be useful for the next mission. The head of the new mission went to see General Donovan in Washington, D.C., and listened to his very nebulous suggestions for training and organization. After the conference, Eifler set up several training centers in Maryland. Area B, located about 70 miles from Washington, was the most important of these. The location subsequently transformed into Camp David, a presidential retreat in the United States. In early April 1942, the force, which was formerly known as OSS Detachment 101, started its rigorous training regimen with a strength of 21 men. According to William A. Pierce's memoirs, the group's designation was chosen to make it seem like the unit had been activated for a long time and was well established. Pierce later succeeded Eifler as commander of Detachment 101. The training covered a wide range of topics related to sabotage and subversion behind enemy lines, including the use of high explosives, cryptography, search and rescue techniques, and many more. In order to be ready for direct confrontation with the enemy, members of the group also underwent rigorous training in unarmed combat methods. Training for battle included violent, disruptive, and savage tactics. Death or torture might result from being captured. In order to avoid torture in the case of their capture by the enemy, OSS members might take suicide pills if they so desired. An integral part of OSS training was parachuting. In order to carry out sabotage missions effectively, operatives are supposed to land behind enemy lines. The training also included methods for deploying small vessels from submarines to land on hostile beaches. Every effort was taken to ensure that the training was realistic. A program tailored to the Pacific Theater was launched in late 1943. Toyon Bay on Catalina Island, off the coast of Southern California, was the location of a pre-war boys' school and later became an OSS training camp. Isolation and relative inaccessibility were factors on the site selection. For individuals slated for the China-Burma-India theater, the training duration proved to be surprisingly short. At the tail end of May 1942, the reconstituted squad sailed overseas for Asia. A sluggish freighter transported the unit to its next duty station. Additionally, the ship had all of the supplies that Detachment 101 could quickly acquire in order to be ready for deployment. On July 4, 1942, the contingent reached Karachi, which is currently in Pakistan. In the northeastern part of India, near the Burmese border, the guys continued their journey to Nazira, Assam. Several airfields in the town's area were maintained by the United States Air Transport Command, ATC, which was in charge of flying supplies to China. The Americans wasted little time getting in touch with the British officials in the area. They knew all there was to know about Burma and the Japanese involvement there. The first trainees to Detachment 101 were trained in demolition techniques and strategies for destroying various sites vital to Japanese military operations during the program's establishment. At first, the students were primarily British and Anglo-Burmese, and the American teachers picked up nearly as much knowledge from them as they imparted. The first round of would-be saboteurs had far more first-hand knowledge of Burmese culture and geography than their American instructors. The Americans also understood that a great deal of indigenous Burmese help would be necessary for the mission's long-term success. Lowland Burmese, who had hoped that their Asian neighbors would rescue them, helped the Japanese invasion along, which was a major factor in the Japanese success. Such was ultimately not the case, and the disillusionment felt by the Burmese as a result of the abuse they endured at the hands of the Japanese quickly set in. A wide variety of languages and dialects are spoken by the many ethnic groups that make up Burma. The hill tribes of northern Burma live apart from the Burmese people who inhabit the lowlands' agricultural soil. Compared to their southern neighbors, the Karen, Shan, Papong, Chin and Kachin peoples were far more combative and belligerent. Throughout the 1940s, they resided in secluded communities surrounded by thick forests. Prior to the outbreak of war, these indigenous communities had formed close ties with the British and comprised the bulk of the indigenous soldiers that the Europeans had trained and commanded. The hill people were a formidable fighting force in the jungle and may have been part of a guerrilla group that could have challenged the Japanese dominance of the country's hilly regions. The United States wanted these fighters to join the Allies as soon as possible. Detachment 101's plan for the Burma campaign included 3 main points. 1. Destroying bridges, railways and mines that the Japanese used to control the country and transport supplies and equipment across the countryside. 2. Ambushing enemy personnel and spying on their movements when possible. And 3. Retrieving downed airmen from Japanese territory. The detachment strategy involved dropping small groups of men into remote jungle regions in close proximity to their designated objectives. Native Kachin people would serve as guides and saboteurs in each unit. When the crews met other tribesmen in the hill villages, the Kachins could translate for them because they understood the country. Attacking an unsuspecting objective, destroying it, and then swiftly retrenchment were all part of guerrilla tactics. No long-term commitments were considered. So long as they moved swiftly and disappeared, the aggressors would have the upper hand. This kind of combat was clearly mastered by the unit and its Kachin trainees. Despite the jungle's many dangers, it provided perfect cover for its hit-and-run operations. Pungis, spear-shaped strips of 2-foot bamboo that the Kachins hardened over fire until they were razor-sharp, were planted in the underbrush by the indigenous people. These were positioned next to forest pathways and inflicted severe harm on Japanese soldiers who were caught off guard. In order to transport the teams and their equipment into enemy territory, the ATC provided C-87 planes. These freight planes were repurposed from B-24 Liberator heavy bombers by the Air Corps. The plane also needed special hardware to let parachutists jump out. Supply missions and post-mission team member pickups also made use of these planes. Whenever feasible, the air traffic controllers provided the required planes. In many cases, the crew's goal in trying to get back to their bases was to rescue fallen ATC members. In cases where air rescue was not feasible, the crews occasionally had to traverse hostile territory on foot. In his pursuit of reclaiming Burma from the Japanese, General Stilwell was obliged to maintain an important road and train connection between his Chinese forces stationed in the field and Calcutta, India. If these important routes were to be cut off, the only way to resupply these troops would be by airlift, which would significantly weaken the Chinese forces. Behind enemy lines, Detachment 101 conducted operations like as radio reporting of Japanese army movements, severely interdicting enemy supply lines, and ambushing isolated Japanese forces where feasible. Stilwell began his concerted assault on Myitkyina, the primary Japanese base in northern Burma, in April 1944. The Allied supply routes that linked the Lado Road to the Burma Road, the main ground supply line to the Chinese forces in eastern Burma and beyond, were harried by Japanese aircraft stationed at Myitkyina. 3,000 newly enlisted Americans, later dubbed Merrill's Marauders, an experienced mixed-race British force known as the Chindits, comprising British, Gurkha, Nigerian, Chinese and Burmese soldiers, and 2 Chinese divisions, the 22nd and the 38th, made up Stilwell's three-pronged attack force. A group of American instructors had taught the Chinese soldiers in India, army instructors under the leadership of Stilwell himself. Stilwell ordered the Chinese to launch an all-out attack on the Japanese bastion, the Americans to surround the Japanese right flank from the east, and the Chindits to penetrate the area behind Japanese lines from the west, as they were moving west from India. As Stilwell's main forces advanced, Detachment 101 guided the way and kept up the disruption of Japanese communications and supply activities behind enemy lines. It seemed like the fight for control of Myitkyina was ended by May 17th, when the Allies had taken the city's vital airport. Tragically, that changed. Some of Stilwell's Chinese units were entrusted with the distinction of completing the city capture by the general. On the other hand, the city's capture was ordered by two very inexperienced Chinese battalions. They casually attacked each other and had to retreat due to the significant casualties caused by friendly fire. Rapidly reorganizing, the Japanese were able to deliver supplies and reinforcements to their struggling defenders. The Allies did not succeed in driving the Japanese out of Myitkyina until August, and the Japanese were then forced to retire to their camps in southern Burma. The threat posed by Japanese aircraft to the Ledo and Burma roads was eliminated with the loss of Myitkyina. As it retreated south, Detachment 101 persisted in harassing the enemy. A small number of enemy soldiers were able to make it to the Japanese outpost at Bamo, but Stilwell's attack party, which included the marauders, the Chindits, and the Chinese, also took heavy casualties in combat. During the long process of taking Myitkyina, the attacking forces had been exposed to a number of tropical diseases, which may be very debilitating. The fighters who had captured the town needed a lot of time to relax and recuperate after being relieved by the occupation forces. After the engagement, the marauders were almost a disbanded force due to the heavy casualties they sustained. As they continued to take heavy casualties in their hastened southerly advance in search of the Japanese, the Chindits met the same fate a few months later. Individual tragedies befell the marauder and Chindit chiefs as well. During the Myitkyina War, General Frank Merrill, after whom the marauders were named, had to be replaced due to 3 crippling heart attacks. On March 24, 1944, the flamboyant commander of the Chindits, Brigadier Ord Wingate, passed away in a plane crash. As they began to retreat slowly, the Japanese troops suffered a string of devastating losses, the first of which was the fall of Myitkyina. The Allies' air support and ever-expanding armies presented a new challenge. In contrast, the Japanese were no longer provided with replacement troops and discovered that the Kachin Rangers of Detachment 101 relentlessly harassed their severely reduced supply lines. Additionally, orders were given to Detachment 101 to broaden the training program for the Burmese fighters. This program now encompassed a large number of Southerners, Shans, and other lowland Burmese who had originally sided with the Japanese. The number of guerrilla forces under the command of Detachment 101 had grown into the thousands at this point. As the combat in Burma came to a close, Detachment 101 also began an extensive propaganda campaign, distributing leaflets supposedly issued by the Japanese High Command that demanded surrender from the Japanese troops. Japanese morale was already low as they were withdrawing, and the leaflets just made matters worse. Town after town fell to the enemy, despite their relentless fighting. Mandalay and Rangoon, the 2 largest cities in the country, were at last freed. Midway through July 1945, the OSS Burma operation was discontinued per directives from Washington. An astounding collection of numbers confirmed the outstanding success of the guerrilla operations carried out by Detachment 101. The largest strength of the detachment was 689 men, including 131 officers and 558 enlisted men. As it went about its business, The battalion taught guerrilla tactics to almost 10,000 indigenous soldiers, the majority of whom were Kachins. According to the data provided by the Northern Combat Area Command, NCAC, Detachment 101 was responsible for the deaths or injuries of almost 10,000 Japanese, the capture of 75, the destruction of 277 enemy vehicles, the derailing of 9 trains, and the destruction of 51 bridges. The rescue of the approximately 232 American airmen whose planes had been shot down during the airlifts over the hump to China was also crucial to their operations. Detachment 101 was cited by the NCAC as the primary source of intelligence delivered to the command. Still, the toll in American lives was shockingly low. Of the Americans in Detachment 101, the enemy was only able to kill 3. 19 more perished in plane disasters. The personnel of the detachment were finally recognized for their achievements in the China-Burma-India theater with a Distinguished Unit Citation by the War Department on January 17, 1946. Command Sergeant William J. Donovan, Wild Bill, who founded the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, and was instrumental in the development of effective covert operations in Burma during War II, passed away on February 8, 1959. For more secret stories of cunning, endurance, and iron resolve, subscribe to The Shadows and the Past.